May 2018 onwards, it is now
The bill just received its second reading. Please be seated. Honorable members, as per usual, we will give the Honorable Attorney General permission to do what he always do. I would say to members that we would like to get through this bill as quickly as possible, and so we would not expect members to go into any long debate or try to debate, because we're not supposed to debate, but of course your usual cooperation and questions, etc.
Mr. Chairman? Forgive me, Mr. Chair, for my lack of memory of the procedures, but as far as I understand, the standing orders suggest that any amendments outside of an order by yourself to suspend the necessary requirements of amendments to any bill to be 2 days. I haven't seen any suspension of those standing orders yet.
Thank the member for his inquiry, but there is a waiver of notice, as you would read in the standing orders, and I have provided all of that to members. Well, there is, from what I can see, a set of amendments to come, and I don't know about any more than yes. And that's what I received and gave permission to. I would trust that members have them.
Mr. Chair, if I just would be allowed your permission, I respect this Honorable House and the Chair and his abilities and authority to waive that notice, but I have to ask that my concern be recorded in the minutes of this Honorable House, because as this House knows, the opposition does not have the access to the resources like the government to have an attorney available or funding for persons to help assist us with the necessary analysis of the bills that are being suggested to be changed. It's already a short enough time without any resources to assist us with the implications and ripple effects of these changes of the bill on a 2-day period, much less 1 hour ago, when we got notified of these changes. So I want it to be noted in this House that we just received these changes an hour ago and is expected with no resources available to the opposition to go through and peruse this law and the potential ripple effects to the overall bill that was released some 21 days ago.
Mr. Chairman.
Honorable Premier.
Mr. Chairman, the vast majority of the amendments proposed by the government here arise as a result of the representations made by CPR and through the mouths of some members of the opposition, notably the member who just spoke. We received those representations on Sunday night. The debate started on Monday. Today is Wednesday. We are doing everything we can to facilitate what has been asked for by some members of the opposition, notably the member who spoke. If the member is now saying that he does not wish the government to do this, then he should say so clearly, rather than trying to present a situation that the government is somehow springing this upon them at the last moment.
Mr. Chair, if you permit, sir.
Member for Georgetown Central.
I thank the Honorable Premier for his contribution, but I'm not suggesting that the government intentionally has sprung this on us. But I think it's important that the general public who listens to the proceedings of this Honorable House are aware of the limitations presented in the current makeup of structure of this Parliament with the lack of resources. And when things like this happen within 1 hour, though I appreciate the changes are addressing some key concerns of the private sector individuals who created this People's Initiative referendum, I want the public to know we don't have the resources like the government. We don't have access to lawyers. And in normal cases, we have to go and get our own analysis and sometimes even pay for it within the short 2-day period. So I'm just only presenting the limitations that the opposition have before them, not to accuse the government of intentionally doing so, but being mindful of what the current structure offers the opposition. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I'm sure that you've had the bill for the constitutional time, 21 days. So, well, what is it you're querying now then?
But Mr. Chair, I agree that the bill itself gave me the 21 days, and I appreciate that and respect that process, but I'm talking about the amendments. One change of a word in a bill can change the whole bill. So the same analysis it takes to look over the whole bill, there has to be a reasonable amount of time as well as a reasonable amount of access to resources to do that job. And unfortunately, I'm saying today on behalf of the opposition, so the public can understand, we don't have those resources, so therefore when it's committed to us to only have 1 hour to peruse this, it creates difficulties for us to do our job on behalf of the people of this country.
Honorable member, on the 14th of next month, God willing, I will spend 35 years here, and what you talked about is what I went through it and came in, talked all I want to talk, and asked all the questions that I need to ask. And I do understand what you're saying when we get it in a day, but you had this from yesterday in our...
I apologize, Mr. Chair. This is the first time I saw this was right before we broke for the lunch. The first time this was presented. That was an hour and minutes ago.
After the Premier's speech is when we handed it over.
Well, that's what committee stage is for, though. You ask questions, and I don't think we can go any further now with what you have mentioned. The House is now in committee, and so with the leave of the committee, as I said, usually we would authorize the Honorable Attorney General to correct any minor errors and such like in the bill. Clerk. Sorry, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, without trying to belabor this, the issue that is currently brought to the floor by the member from Georgetown Central, there are some, it leaves us somewhat handicapped with not being able to consult on these matters and try to see how they address the issues that the Premier said that we brought to the government's attention. It does leave us somewhat handicapped because those issues you can appreciate were trashed out over a 21-day period when the bill was gazetted. And whilst we only have two, we were only required to notify for two. But if that's what it is, that's what it is, and we're just going to have to.
No, what I'm saying that that's not just what it is today. Has been for a long time, and that you do. Sometimes we are fortunate to get amendments a lot of time in advance. Other times we are not, because it don't come to the government's attention at times. And you've been in cabinet, and you know this. You've been right where we all are right now on the next right-hand side, and you know that happens at times. Is there if there is something in here that you are complaining specifically about, then I would suggest we bring that to the attention of the Attorney General when we get to it, so that we can deal with it and not go through a long preamble at this point.
Well, you know, Mr. Chairman, I hear you, sir, and the difficulty with that is we are going to be here for a while getting explanations for it, but be that as it may, let's proceed.
Sir. Okay, good. Clark.
There's an amendment to the preamble, and there's no way to take a vote on the preamble. There's an amendment to the preamble, but then we don't take a vote on the preamble. I don't know whether it's,
I think you read this. The title? No?
no, I don't read the title, but this is the first amendment.
But okay, there is an amendment to the preamble, and I suggest that and I hope I'm writing this, that we will read the preamble and then we take the amendment, if there is an amendment to it.
Or just, should we take a vote on the preamble? What, we've never done that before.
We just got to do the same thing we have always
And then Attorney General will clean it up. But you have a specific amendment to that preamble.
That's the first amendment.
The referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019.
Is the Premier moving that, or is the Attorney General? Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 52, Suborder 1 and 2, Suborders 1 and 2, I give notice to move the following amendments to the referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019. That the bill be amended in the third paragraph of the preamble by deleting the words, quote, has settled the wording of the referendum question and has made a determination, unquote, and substituting the words, open quote, shall settle the wording of the referendum question and shall make a determination, unquote.
Is the Premier speaking to it, or leave it at that?
Mr. Chairman,
I think it speaks for itself. I don't know if you want it,
I was
but
just going to say swiftly, Mr. Chairman, the Honorable Attorney General went into some considerable detail yesterday,
yes.
explaining that although the view of the government and its advisors was and is that the current provisions of the bill are adequate, and indeed, even if the sequence of events and actions taken by the cabinet were irregular in any respect, the passage of this bill would cure such procedural defects. But that notwithstanding, we wish to avoid as far as possible any basis for further delay of the referendum, which would almost inevitably occur if there were judicial review of any aspect of the bill or the procedure. And thus, These proposed changes are to address the issues in this regard raised by CPR on the basis of the opinion from their council matrix.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that new wording shall settle the wording of a referendum question shall make a determination on the date for the holding of a referendum in a manner prescribed by this law, which is now being prescribed in Clause 4. In Clause 4. Which, and I know we haven't reached that yet, but which then says it's by regulation. Can the Premier tell us in what way can we now do regulation to do the, and notwithstanding the explanation that the Attorney General gave yesterday, the fact is that that would be all well and good if an actual referendum law was in place in accordance with the Constitution. But we are here making one law for this specific referendum. Were it the case that the primary legislation was in place, Cabinet would not have to come here, in my view, to make a law to do a referendum. In accordance with the Constitution, they would merely have to set the question and set the date, determine the question and set the date. How are we going now to do it by regulations? Should it not be by order in the Gazette? Are they the same?
Mr. Chairman, the Constitution actually does not require it by its expressly an overarching piece of legislation to govern referendums. We have had two without the benefit of any such law, albeit they were not people initiated. What the Section 70 says is, with respect to the wording of the question and the determination of the date, is that Cabinet shall settle the wording of a referendum question or questions within a reasonable time period as prescribed by law. And the Cabinet shall make a determination on the date the referendum shall be held in a manner prescribed by law. It doesn't say overarching law, it says by law. We are passing, or we have just gone through the second reading and we are passing a referendum law. So it is more than proper and adequate for the relevant provisions to be contained in this law, and therefore what happens will be prescribed by the particular law that we are passing. It should be borne in mind that the function of setting the question, the wording of the question, or settling it I should say, and determining the date is not a function of the Parliament. It is a function of the Cabinet. So what we are proposing to do is to remove that wording of the question from the law, from the bill, and simply acknowledge in the legislation that this is what will occur. And then Cabinet, by way of regulation, will settle the question and determine the date. And then that will be gazetted. So the sequence of events that has been complained about, or that has been urged that it will be in accordance with what CPR are advocating.
Mr. Chairman, I quite understand the Premier's position on this, and I agree with him in much of it, in that it is Cabinet's responsibility to determine and set in that order. But does that not mean, whilst the Constitution does not have any prescription as to how that goes about, and no overarching provision, does that not mean Section 70 would have had to be put in place? That is a law. Cabinet responsibility comes under 72 after a law, a primary piece of legislation has been put in place. This is not a primary piece of legislation.
It is.
Well, not in accordance with the Constitution for a people-initiated Oh, are you saying this is now the people-initiated referendum law? Is that what we're saying?
The law, Mr. Chairman, it is a primary piece of legislation governing the conduct of this particular people-initiated referendum.
Thank you. I am trying to determine, maybe I should ask, the question should be then, when are we going to do, or do we agree, does the government agree that there's a need for an overarching primary legislation to govern referendums?
No, that you might want to ask that question, but it's certainly not.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mind answering it, sir.
Well, I just want to say that it's not in front. It's not on the table. It's not here. So we can't debate it at this point.
No, Mr. Chairman, I'm not asking to debate it. My question was, that question has relevance to my initial question, which was, is it through regulations or through regulations, gazetted regulation, or order a gazetted order from Cabinet? Because there is some method to my madness as to how those regulations are going to be operated. In the interest of transparency, I'm doing this. I'm asking these questions. I'm not going to get into the business of a law that is not here, but certainly the Constitution is here, which governs the making of law. And the Constitution, whilst it does not have an overarching instruction on how referendums are to be held, conducted, it requires this Parliament to make that law for that conduct.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, as I said, I don't know that we could get into it, but the Honorable Premier has offered to answer, and I hope we can move on from there, because we need to discuss this law and go through the stages, committee stages on this law, notwithstanding the fact that you all have a gripe about other substantive legislation, but that's not here. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said when I delivered the speech introducing the bill, I think all of us who are involved with this would have come to understand that the whole process would be better off if there were, or if there was, an overarching piece of legislation that governed the conduct of referendums and the process leading up to it. A bespoke, standalone provision like we have in elections law. But the Constitution doesn't require it. There's nothing in here that says that's what should be done. And so the previous two referendums have been conducted on the basis of a bespoke piece of legislation passed for the purpose of that specific referendum. This one is the same case. But the fact that it is not an overarching piece of legislation does not mean it is not primary legislation. It is still primary legislation. Primary legislation is a piece of legislation passed by the Legislative Assembly of the Cayman Islands. Regulations and other subsidiary legislation, other legislation which is made by Cabinet is subsidiary legislation, or secondary. Thank you, Mr. AG. Secondary legislation. So this piece that we are dealing with is a piece of primary legislation.
Mr. Chairman, I thank my good friend for that lesson in legislative procedures and constitutional law. But I am very aware of that. When I referred to the primary legislation, this not being the primary legislation, I was referring to a primary, generally, it was primary I was referring to primary legislation for as a referendum law as prescribed, required by Section 70. That's what I was talking about. Not necessarily that this is primary legislation for the purposes only of this election, this referendum, and what happens is this falls away. This falls away. So what is the term we use? Sunset clause. That this falls away after the day after the general, or well, a few days after giving all those the right to object or whatever within that period after that. My thing is, this piece of legislation is only being brought because there's not an overarching primary legislation on referendum. That is my thing. My initial question was, we are now saying that it is going to be published. Cabinet would publish the question, the referendum question, by regulation. Is it not that then would infer that we're going to make the regulation under this piece of legislation and do it in that? But that would not be the case if we had overarching primary legislation. It would probably have to come by virtue of order of Cabinet. So why would we want to do it now in regulation? That's the question.
I'm not so sure. I'm not sure it make a difference, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair, sorry. You can do what you're doing here by order to amend if you have a primary. Well, let me get away from the use of the word primary. If a general piece of legislation that regulates the conduct of a referendum, you could probably have a schedule in it, and each time you have a referendum, instead of coming back here to do anything, you could simply amend that schedule by an order. But you can also do, as we have in clause 14, provision to make regulations, and you can do whatever you want to do by regulations. They're all secondary legislation. It's a question of what the government chooses, whether they want to do it by order or whether they want to do it by regulation. Makes no difference to them. The outcome is the same.
I think we can move on now. You have another question?
Go ahead. I'll deal with it under the next.
I think it's proper for us to take the vote on this preamble amendment. All in favor of the amendment to the preamble, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. Clause amendment. Yeah.
Clause 1, short title. Clause 2, interpretation.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question under clause 2 in the definition of lead organization. Would we not wish to narrow that and simply say that CPR, lead organization, means CPR can appoint observers? Because I don't want us to get in a situation where other organizations might come forward and say, well, they help get signatures, so they want to be a lead organization. Just a question.
Mr. Chairman, we spent some time about this and we've looked at legislation elsewhere, and this is how it's done. They never name organizations. They call them permitted parties or lead organizations.
And you are comfortable that this would prevent other people or other organizations that assisted in getting signatures to claim to be a lead organization and they want to appoint observers as well?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the intricacies of that. I know the most vocal and apparent lead organization is CPR. I don't know what internal workings there are.
Mr. Chair?
Section Central?
Mr. Chairman, just for,
The
the AG just reminded me, we've only received a petition from CPR, from nobody else.
member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the amendments number 2, the amendment calls for the amendment of the initial bill in clause 4 by deleting.
We haven't reached clause 4 yet. We're going 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, but number 2 talks about.
Clause 3, holding of referendum.
Question is that clauses 1, 2, and 3 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Clauses 1 to 3 stands part of the bill.
Clause 4, matter of national importance and referendum question.
There's an amendment to Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 52.1 and 2, I give notice to move the following amendment to the referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019, that the bill be amended in Clause 4 by deleting subsections 2, 3, and 4 and substituting the following. Quote 2, subsection 2, the Cabinet shall, in accordance with Section 70, 2B of the Constitution, settle the wording of the referendum question for determining the matter of national importance under subsection 1 within 30 days of the coming into force of this law. 3. In settling the wording of the referendum question, the Cabinet shall, as far as possible, ensure that the referendum question is A, clear and simple, B, directed at the core matter of national importance under subsection 1, C, unambiguous, and D, neutral. Subclause 4, upon settling the wording of the referendum question under subsection 2, the Cabinet shall promptly publish the referendum question A, by regulations in the Gazette, B, in at least one newspaper circulating in the islands, and C, on government websites. Subclause 5, Cabinet shall prescribe the form of the ballot paper to be used for the purpose of the referendum in the regulations made under subsection 4A. Subclause 6, the outcome of the referendum shall be binding on the government and the legislature if more than 50% of persons registered as electors pursuant to the Elections Law 2017 revision vote in the referendum in favor of or against the referendum question.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if the Premier can tell us if this amendment, which changes the entire face of how we're going to determine, settle the word on the wording of the referendum question. If this now changes the timelines to the potential for the referendum being set, the date being set, at least 60 days away.
I'm not sure I understand that, but the answer is no. This changes nothing at all. These, Mr. Chairman, these provisions which are adopted from the Venice Convention that's been talked about so much are the same exact principles the Cabinet proceeded to settle the question in the first instance. They are just now being given force in the actual legislation itself.
Okay. If you read Section 3 of the bill in conjunction with
Clause 3.
No. Section 3.
Clause 3. Bills don't have sections.
Clause 3 of the bill holding a referendum. Clause 3.2 in conjunction with this amendment of Clause 4, 2, it says 60 days. Potential is 60 days.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I understand what Mr. McLean is saying now. But as long as we complete this process by Friday, nothing changes. What will happen is as soon as the law is assented to and gazetted, Cabinet will convene to formally settle the question and determine the date. And that will then be gazetted by virtue of regulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. And I'm going to give my other colleagues some opportunity to, but the fact that the question is now being removed from here, from the bill, and will be settled within the next 30 days, quote unquote. Is it the government intention to change the wording of the question? And also the date, despite the Premier saying that nothing changes if he gets it completed by Friday. And if while you're doing that, if the government intends also to, I think the letter that was sent to your good self and the governor and myself indicated that, that's by the law firm, indicated that their clients were prepared to meet with us, with you, not me, with Cabinet. Is it the intention of government to engage them now in the settling of the question and the date?
No, Mr. Chairman, not at all. Not at all. In fact, that would be unconstitutional. The Constitution is quite clear that it is the function of Cabinet to do both of these things. You cannot, on the one hand, complain that the Cabinet has not followed sequentially the required procedure, and then when the government concedes and proposes to do so, then say that you have the right to come and negotiate what the question is. CPR has no standing, this Parliament has no standing in determining what the question and the date is. They can make representations as they have done, but the function is constitutionally allocated to the Cabinet.
And I will not try to take that away, Mr. Chairman, from the Premier and the Cabinet. However, my many years of service here, whether you agree with good, bad, or indifference, has taught me that there's a little word that I learned after coming in here: stakeholders and consultation. Or you have had that with CPR, with the lead organization.
We've had the letter from the attorneys, which we have taken into consideration. We have said publicly we've taken into consideration. Let me settle one thing right now. I probably should have done it in my debate. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I was raised up in a traditional Caymanian home where respect was accorded to everyone, no matter what your standing and stature. People want to know why I have steadfastly refused to have any dialogue with CPR, because you do not go on the radio and accuse me of corruption and call me tyrant and all manner of evil, and then write a polite letter saying you would like to sit down around the table with me. Nor will I sit down around the table in these sort of manners with a convicted criminal who is disqualified from participating in an election process as a candidate because of a conviction for dishonesty, and at the same time calling me, my government, and in particular my deputy premier, corrupt. So if the CPR leadership team had treated the government with just basic respect, I don't stand on office or principle, but I have done nothing that warrants anyone accusing me of being corrupt and then writing me the next day and saying, I would like to meet with you, Mr. Premier. I will not have any truck with those people. They will communicate with me through their lawyers.
Mr. Chairman.
Member from Northside.
He has given way to me.
You're giving way. Leader of the opposition.
Mr. Chairman, may I just say to the Premier, in response to that, I don't hold any brief for anybody in here. I can tell you, I have unfriended some people from on that side too. I need you to know that, because I stand on the same principles and that you stand on, and I have never accused anybody of being corrupt. I don't know unless you come look for me with something, and nobody has come to me yet. I don't hold any brief for anyone. It is merely in the interest of transparency and cooperation that I bring that up. Mr. Premier, that is your choice, that is your position, that is your right. I said I'm not going to meet with your cruise liner organization either, unless it's about a specific thing. You're going to have to live with yours, I will live with mine.
The member from Northside.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if the Premier would be mindful to give a commitment to the House that the question, as is worded in the bill that is being removed, and the date will in fact remain the same.
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, these are, as I just said, are matters for the Cabinet. I cannot be presumptive in here and say that is what the Cabinet is going to do. But I do believe that the House can take comfort in the fact that we have put forward this question and the proposed date voluntarily and have published it. So, in very short order, I think it'll be clear what the Cabinet has decided. But I think you can take as a good indication what Cabinet will do from what has already been published. That is really as far as I can go. I probably have even crossed the line.
The member for Georgetown Central.
You follow?
Mr. Chair, following on to the question just posed by the member from Northside, had similar concerns as well as to whether the date and the question is going to stay the same. Because if there is a possibility that it's going to be changed, then we also may have to amend Section 4.1 that practically outlines what the question is about. Question 4.1 says, which we've decided based on the amendments.
Clause 4.1, I think you mean?
Yeah, clause, sorry, apologize. Clause 4.1, which says, the matter of national importance is whether the Cayman Islands continue to move forward with the building of the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo project facility.
Mr. Chairman, I believe I can help the member. Mr. Chairman, I've just moved an amendment to Section 4. If the member looks at paragraph 2. No, he's talking about clause 4. Clause 4.1. We are not proposing to change clause 4.1. No, Mr. Chairman. What is in clause 4.1 is this. The matter of national importance is whether the island should continue to move forward with the building of the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port facility. Mr. Chairman, with the exception of the inclusion of the enhanced cargo port facility, the language of that subclause 4.1, is taken from the CPR petition and from the material that was on their website saying what they wanted to do. We have striven and are continuing to strive to reflect as far as it is possible what it is that we are able to discern that petitioners wanted done. The one area of disagreement which we will not resolve is they do not wish the enhanced cargo port facility to be included in the question, but as we have pointed out over and over again, the project has always and only ever been about both components, the cruise berthing and the enhanced cargo port. They are indivisible, and voters are being asked whether or not to proceed with this project. Not being asked whether we should separate out the cargo port bit with all the issues about how that would be funded, etc., etc. So there's only one project. So I have not indicated that we propose to change the question, but in any event, it would still be in accordance with these basic provisions, regardless of how it's worded.
Mr. Chair, through you, and that's exactly what I was trying to get at. I just want to make sure that we clarify that the parameters are still going to be based on clause 4.1, which has those indications, and because there was a possibility of changing, I want to make sure that the listing public knows that it won't be going outside of those parameters, regardless of if there is a minor change by the cabinet.
It's an undertaking I can give, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
I member for Newlands.
I wonder if now that we've established that the CPR petition did not introduce the question on cargo, the cargo facility, wouldn't it now be improper to proceed on that basis of including that in this referendum? And what are the government's thoughts on actually having a separate referendum on cargo only? If the government feels that it's that important.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know how many more times I can explain that the project is indivisible. You cannot ask a question which is practically, which cannot be answered properly in practical terms. There is no separate cruise berthing facility project that is proceeding. Now we have made the case over and over again. We have passed the bill. Had we not included the question in this bill, there would have been no scope for this discussion in committee stage, because the determination of the question is a constitutionally assigned role or responsibility of the cabinet, not the members of the Legislative Assembly.
But, Mr. Chairman, in the context of Section 70 of the Constitution, though, it is relevant for us to discuss that, because the matter of national importance raised by CPR is only cruise berthing. So if the government wanted to have a question on cargo, then perhaps the government should have its own referendum on
But
cargo.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable members, though, we don't want to advance this, because we've discussed this, debated it, and really we need to stick to amendments, etc.
But, Mr. Chairman, if I may, sir, clause 3 and the amendment, sub 3, I think it is 4.3, says in settling the wording of the referendum question, the cabinet shall, as far as possible, ensure that the referendum question is 1, A, clear and simple, B, directed at the core matter of national importance under subsection 1.
Honorable member,
On a,
honorable member, honorable leader of the opposition, what I am saying is that we have traversed this ground already in the debate. And what we're doing now is rehashing the debate, which is not permitted.
no, Mr. Chairman, I beg to differ.
I know you are differing, but I'm not going to make you differ much longer. I'll give you a couple more minutes to do it.
Mr. Chairman, we debated the bill as presented and gazetted. We are here changing that.
You talked about it.
Therefore,
But not this point, Mr. Speaker. The same question that we're talking about now is the same question that is in the bill.
no,
Yes, read it. Or you want me to read it for you?
Mr. Chairman, subsection 3 of 4 in the bill is about the ballot paper to be used for the purpose of the referendum shall be in the form set out in Schedule 1. Subsection 3 now has turned. This point we didn't debate. The amendments we did not debate.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not suggesting he's debated them, but the member is quite intentionally ignoring the subclause above the one he just read, which has the question not only printed there, but printed in bold. And it was debated exhaustively in the debate on the second reading.
Mr. Chairman, I totally agree with my good friend the Premier. However, he is now introducing a new provision in this amendment to be included in this law, in this bill. The one about the guidelines on how it got be settled. And you're saying that we should not be able to question that because we have already.
Honorable member, I said very plainly, very clearly, not about not being a question. What I'm hearing is an ongoing debate. And I begged members earlier for certain reasons that we try to keep the questions and be as judicious as we can in what we have to say because of the timing for certain reasons.
And Mr. Chairman, I want to be as cooperative as possible with you and the Premier. However, there are questions that needs to be asked on how this thing is going to work because we had the presentation by the government on the bill as was. And I'm saying now, there are at least you need to be able to get an explanation from the government now again as to how these new clauses are going to work.
Mr. Chairman, there is nothing. The debate, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, the debate, and it's quite deliberate, and I don't mind because I've been on that side. The effort by especially the deputy leader is to reopen the debate on whether or not
Mr. Chairman, no, I have
cargo
a
port facility should be a part or not of the question. We, as you said, Mr. Chairman, we've been over that ground over and often, as the old people say.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, we have not been over all this ground because you are introducing an amendment to the bill. And that amendment sets out criteria. And one of those criteria is unambiguous. If you have a question that refers to two projects, port, cruise berthing, and cargo, that is ambiguity. It is. So you are now introducing a question that does not meet the guidelines of what you're introducing in your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, shall I answer that shortly? By reference, again, to the Constitution and to what we are trying to do. One of the objections of the opposition and the CPR through their counsel.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, we're
Mr.
in
Chairman, I am speaking.
There's no need to slag us off. We're doing our job.
The member from Newlands, when the premier finish, you can.
Yeah, the member needs to get rid of that. We call it. What you call it? Stuff that you wrap up things in, but very, very thin skin. I'm not slagging off anybody. Mr. Chairman, it is this. The complaint was, as I understand it, that Cabinet had gone ahead and decided the question and determined the date before this law was passed. So we think that, as I said earlier, that could be cured by passing any procedural irregularity would be cured by passing the legislation. But no, we say out of an abundance of caution and in deference to what the other side is saying, we are going to remove that from the bill, pass the bill, and then Cabinet will exercise its constitutionally assigned function of settling the question and determining the date. Now, us having agreed to that, the deputy leader of the opposition is now trying to take onto himself a function which is constitutionally given to Cabinet alone, after having complained that we shouldn't have brought it to Parliament in the first place.
Mr. Chairman, I'm doing nothing, no such thing. I don't understand where the Premier is going with that argument, but anyway, my whole point of raising this was to point out that the guidelines now include the word ambiguity, unambiguous. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, I'm asking a question because I would like an answer on how the government thinks about it. I mean, it is a Cabinet function, but the Cabinet is enabled by this legislature, so I have a right to ask you any question on the amendments. I'm simply asking questions, and I would, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but it's my job to ask. Don't you think that it would be reasonable now, based on the ambiguity clause in there, that you're introducing some ambiguity? Because you're now talking about cruise berthing, or you have been talking about cruise berthing and cargo. Putting that in there, it's really become, in a sense, a possibility that you can confuse people, because you may have people who support cargo but don't support cruise berthing.
Whatever the question is that you want to ask, you have to ask a question. What we not want to get into is this matter the one project, two components, cruise, cargo, and that was debated, right? The cargo thing was debated, and so are we going now to try to debate that back again? Sounds to me that's what it is, though, Honourable Member.
No, Mr. Chairman. I'm only asking, doesn't the Premier feel that introduces some ambiguity?
I thought he must have said 100 times that it wasn't, but anyway.
Mr. Chair.
No, Mr. Chairman, the answer, as you correctly said, is no. But let me say this. What is being proposed in the amendment here, as I said, is a distillation of the principles from the Venice Convention on the good conduct of referendums. These are the same principles that we used in the previous determination. We are now giving them the force of law. If at the end of this exercise, when the government publishes the question, the member or anyone else feels that we have not complied with this, then they can do what they're threatening to do, seek judicial review. We shall meet it when it comes.
Mr. Chair,
Going to move shortly to the next matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but please allow me these two questions in respect to this, because everybody's been speaking and I haven't got my chance to talk about that particular point. But I must say that I agree that this word ambiguous came up after. The first time I heard it referred to was right before the second to last speaker, the Attorney General. So it wasn't reference to in the bill itself, because I would have gone at very much length within my debate to talk about the lack of clarity that many people have expressed to me in respect to the question. So if we are creating guidelines now for how the framing of the question in the new law, we should have been able to talk about what the guideline. What we're doing is putting guidelines in now after we've created the law. I could have said, listen, maybe there should be added guidelines in the bill. I'm a bit confused myself in respect to adding new elements to the bill after the bill has been debated.
What is the member asking? Are you asking a question?
Okay, here's the question, Mr. Chairman. Is it normal practice to add brand new elements to a bill that you've already debated that goes outside of the remit of the debate?
Mr. Chairman,
Premier,
that happens in almost any piece of substantial or legislation of a substantial nature here. I have seen 50, 60 different clauses included. Mr. Speaker, in any event, I was insistent, as the AG will attest to, that when we published the question initially, that we put out the principles by which we had determined what the wording of the question should be. They came from this very same source, the Venice Convention. All we are doing now is giving the force of, or seeking to give the force of law to those principles, which are guided what the Cabinet has done so far, and to ensure that everyone is aware that these are the principles which will guide the question when it is formally settled and gazetted. That's all.
Mr. Chair, I want to move on myself, so I'll ask this last question because it's important and the reason why I'm getting to this point. I appreciate and accept that the government has recognized their failings in respect to this bill and has now decided to separate the questioning from the bill itself. I respect that. Thank you for manning up and accepting your faults. But here's what my problem is, Mr. Speaker. I am concerned that this bill, because the question has been separated, will now be the new bill being used moving forward as a base bill for referendums. And no. So what I'm concerned about is because it becomes like what the leader of opposition saying, a general law to deal with referendums, there may be a temptation to use this in the future without proper regulations on how you deal with the questioning for the future. And is that a reasonable fear? Is my question.
Could continue this unless there's something else that's going to be asked. First it was about cargo, now it's going to something else again.
Mr. Chair,
on the same item.
Mr. Chair, my question was not answered, sir. Unless you're overruling, Mr. Chair, to say that my question is not going to be answered, which I will accept.
But I don't want to tell you that it is plain as the nose on your face that any new matter that you want to bring or anybody going to start for a referendum will come to this House by a law. Am I right? Or by a bill to become law. That's obvious. I mean, you would have to go through the whole rigmarole again of getting 25%.
Well, Mr. Chair, maybe the
I think
government,
that's understandable.
but Mr. Chair, maybe the government can give their commitment today that will actually create a proper referendum law moving forward. Maybe the Premier would be willing to do that, because obviously he highlighted the concerns.
Can
of
I
having
suggest
one
to you that if
before.
the Premier don't answer you and you don't get the law, that you bring a motion?
Brought a couple of those too, and they
Please.
didn't answer them.
The question is then that the clause,
Mr. Chairman, my apologies, but I do have a question on a separate section. Clause, subclause. But
part of that clause.
the same,
Part of that
same
clause.
amendment, same amendment. 6C.
Which one?
Sorry. Yeah,
We're still on clause 4, you know,
yeah.
and you're talking about 6. There's no 6C, there is 6,
Subsection 6.
which says the outcome of the referendum. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, no. 4, clause 4, subsection 6. Yeah.
The outcome of the referendum shall be binding on the government. That's what you're talking
That's-
about.
Exactly. So, and I brought this up in my debate, but I don't think it was clarified why we were doing this. This clause contains, it says, and I won't read the whole thing, but vote in the referendum in favor of or against the referendum question. Section 70 of the Constitution, if you read that, under the section shall be binding on the government and the legislature if assented to by more than 50% of the persons registered as electors. It doesn't say or against. So my question is, why the difference with the Constitution? The Constitution says one thing and the bill says another.
Okay. Let me, Mr. Speaker, the language in the Constitution is a bit ambiguous. I hate to use that word, but I couldn't think of another one. We actually sought a legal opinion on this, because if you read this literally, there is no way that a no vote could be binding. And that could never be the intent of the section, because the Constitution doesn't refer to anything other than assent. So if we accepted that without further analysis, with the question as proposed, the no vote could never be binding, because the section says, subject to this Constitution, a referendum under this section shall be binding on the government and legislature if assented to. If assented to by more than 50% of persons registered as electors in accordance with Section 90. We looked at it and we said it could never be that the no vote could never be binding. So you would always have to craft the question in a way that it's assented to. So we discussed it, the AG and myself and other counsel, and then we sought a constitutional opinion on it. And they said, you're absolutely right, that can't be the case. So can you imagine the confusion if we simply put that into the law now? What we have put into the law is the clear instruction to the supervised elections and everybody else that the outcome of the referendum shall be binding on the government and the legislature if more than 50% of persons registered as electors pursuant to the Elections Law 2017 revision vote in the referendum in favor of or against. That's why we didn't use the assent, because if we use assent, you wind up with these arguments, well, they didn't assent, they voted against, so therefore it's not binding. It can't be binding. So this is our effort to make sure that if the no vote reaches the threshold, it is clear in the legislation that it is binding. Yeah.
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 This question was asked yesterday, Mr. Premier.
Yeah.
This question was asked to be clarified, which I think this is what does.
Yeah. So that's why. I mean, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, I promise you.
Okay, well, that just leads to a follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. If neither the yes or the no reach the threshold, what happens then?
It's not binding on the legislature or the government.
But what happens then?
The government will have to take a policy decision as to what it will do.
Will the project move forward?
That would be a matter for the cabinet in due course.
Mr. Chair.
The member from Georgetown Central.
I wasn't quite finished because that is where I have an issue with this because, and this is just my view, and I could be wrong, but this is how I looked at it. The Constitution said those assenting to. So you have a question put to the people. Just let me
change the question, that's all.
I'm just trying to get it clear because if neither the yes or the no, I just want a clear understanding of what the government will do because the yes vote is required to reach the threshold in order for the government to proceed. Those assenting to.
Mr. Chairman, I think the member is being confused between binding, the use of the word binding. Binding means the government is bound and the legislature is bound to do something or not to do something, right? But that doesn't mean that if it's not binding, the government can still decide, well, we're not going to go ahead, or we're going to go ahead. To make it binding and not advisory, the distinction is between binding and advisory. The nature of the result, how the result is to be treated.
But my question is still there. If you don't get a binding yes or a binding no, I heard the Premier say in an interview that he would proceed. But in order to proceed, you need to meet that threshold for the yes vote.
No. Mr. Speaker, at the risk of taking up more of the committee's time than necessary, let me go back to basic constitutional principles. You call a general election, a number of candidates, political parties contest the election, there is a result, a government is formed. Everybody ran on some platform or other. In this case, the majority of people who ran and formed the coalition government ran on a platform that included a promise to the electorate that they would build a cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port facility.
Mr. Chair,
majority of the coalition
Mr. Chair,
government. Mr. Chairman, would the member please let me finish? Ran on a platform in which we promised this. Now, way down the road, 6+ years down the road, well, actually, in fairness, 5+ years down the road, a group which has become known as CPR decide that they don't like that government policy. So they start a petition, and a year later, so 6 years plus, they reach the required number to trigger a people-initiated referendum, as the Constitution permits. Their objective is to stop the government executing its policy, which it promised it would do when it was elected. That is significant interference with the government mandate and the government policy. So the Constitution rightly says that if that's what you want to do, you want to stop or change government policy, you've got to demonstrate that more than 50% of the electorate agree with you, because you are now seeking to change the outcome in policy terms of a general election of a democratically elected government. That's why the threshold is where the threshold is. So if you don't reach the threshold, you haven't bound the government to stop proceeding with its project. Now it becomes a political and policy decision of the government faced with the result of a referendum which falls short of the binding threshold to decide whether to proceed or not. That's how the system works. That's how it's set up to work.
Mr. Chair.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to try to ask the Premier not to suggest that there's a majority of cargo and cruise. They campaign on a cruise, but there is not a majority. But it don't make any sense to belittle that because it's going to waste time. But the Premier did say that the Cabinet will have to decide if neither yes nor no makes the threshold of 50% plus one. Isn't it smart for the government to now allow to help them make that decision, the basis of the breakdown of the vote? Because how are can they give indication how they're going to make that decision without making the threshold? Because it's obviously an option available to them if they don't make the threshold not to go forward or to go forward. And this is the same reason why I was debating about the fact of allowing the breakdown by the vote, because each one of the members, he's just said, will have to make a
Chairman,
decision
that's
to
on
move
this
forward.
clause, sir. We'll get to that clause, Mr. Chairman. We're not there yet.
Let's give him some leeway, but anyway. I think we must have gotten to the point where we can move on. We are still at clause. Clause.
The clause is amended. So the question is that amendments then part of the clause?
The question is that the title, the amendment?
The clause is amended, is that part of the bill?
Yes. The question is that the amendment stand part of the clause. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The amendment stands part of the clause. The question is, it's now that clause 4. Clause 4, as amended, stand part of the bill. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Clause is amended. Stands part of the bill.
Clause 5, entitlement to vote. Clause 6, conduct of referendum.
Mr. Chair, are we just announcing these things quickly? What's the story? Because I see that you just jumped from 5 to 6. Did you're going to ask for?
Which one is this?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I heard the clerk say that something about waiting forever. What? Sorry, I apologize. Because a second and a half is not waiting forever.
The clerk had announced clause 5 and clause 6.
Questions? Anybody got questions?
Yes. Continue.
Yeah, that's all.
If whatever one that you have, this is the usual bill. It's the way that we usually conduct in committee, not because this is a referendum that we're not following the usual process
Mr. Chair,
for committee stage. So the clerk got to 5 and got to 6. If there is no questions, she's moving on.
Mr. Chairman, I believe he has, the member has, understands now, but it was a little confusing for him. I want to move on too because
sorry, Mr. Chair,
I need to.
Mr. Leader, I apologize. It wasn't confusing for me. What I'm saying was the simple fact of jumping from the other one to the other one quickly without identifying the fact of whether somebody wanted to ask a question about 5, because I was about to, but in the interest of time, I've decided not to.
You had a question. Okay, she's down to 6.
You get question 5.
You have a question on 5? No, you have no question on 6. Okay. We'll still continue down.
So put a question 5 and 6.
The question is that clauses 5 and 6 do stand part of the bill. Question is that clauses 5 and 6 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clauses 5 and 6 stands part of the bill. Got no business doing this. Yeah, that's what this is.
Clause 7, observers.
Some people you see their back and others you see their face.
Clause 8, legal challenge. Clause 9, presentation of petition under Section 8 and security for costs. Mr. Miller.
The member for Northside
Yeah, I have a question about the legal challenge.
on 8.
My understanding is that for the constituency that I represent, for instance, what is going to happen at the polling station is that, which would normally be 3 boxes, A to L and M to Z, plus postal ballots, are going to be all put into one box to be sealed by the returning officer, to be taken to wherever the counting of the ballots is going to take place. At that counting station, that north side combined 3 boxes is going to be combined with all the other 19 constituencies before the counting starts. My concern is, if there's a legal challenge that asks for a recount, how are you then, for the constituency of Northside, how are you then going to re-separate the ballots from Northside from that big box so that they can be recounted separately? Or is that not anticipated to be a possibility?
I think the AG is going down.
How are you going to determine if that person voted?
So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, sorry, I keep forgetting me in committee. I think at the heart of this concern and understanding is that people, members, and other people are still in the mode of an election campaign where there are candidates. This is a national referendum. There is to be a national count for a national outcome. It does not matter for the purposes of this exercise how Northside votes or Red Bay votes, as the case may be. The only reason you would have a recount is if there is something wrong with the overall count. It's not going to be counted district or constituency by constituency.
Okay, let me rephrase the question then. If there's a challenge to the results of some sort, how are you going in a recount process, ensure that the ballots are recounted are the same ballots that were put in the first place? Do you have a methodology in place to reconcile the ballots that were put in that big box to, I think it's called the counterfoil, to ensure that they're authentic?
Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was just conferring with the supervisor of elections. So once the mix has occurred, they will then be separated into segments, and they will be counted in segments so that if there is an issue, as you say, that requires a recount, you are not recounting everything that's gone before, but once a segment has been completed and there are no challenges to it, that segment is closed. The only time you get into issues around counterfoils is if there's a legal challenge and the court orders that they must see the counterfoils and so forth.
Election office will have in place a system to ensure that that counterfoil system can be certified in the case of any charge. That's my only concern.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
But, Mr.
Leader of the Opposition?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the legal challenge also requires that it be someone who voted. So how are you going to identify that that person voted?
In the same way you'd identify it in an election campaign. I mean, in a election, as part of the election process.
Yeah.
You're just talking about greater numbers, not a difference in process.
Mr. Chairman, just for a little more clarity. So when you separate the ballots into segments, you are going to separate the counterfiles into segments too. So that if the challenge is on segment 2, you will have all the counterfiles for segment 2 separated as well.
Mr. Chairman, I just conferred again with the supervisor of elections. In the elections process, and as far as possible, the referendum process is mirroring that. There is no provision that allows anyone to see those counterfoils in the absence of a court order. So during the counting process, if you think that a ballot has been misread, it's been spoiled, or whatever challenges you have then, you must deal with them then and there. And if you disagree with what the supervisor or the presiding officer has said, and it is material, in other words, it may make a difference in the overall outcome, you can take that to court and challenge in the usual way, like it is with elections.
And that is my concern, is that if the court asks for the counterfiles, the elections office has put in place the necessary provisions to make sure that the counterfiles match the segment. It shouldn't be that difficult because you've already have them separated for north side and east end, and if you've combined them two, then you know what the counterfiles are for those two to make one segment.
Yeah.
And will the results be announced by segments or just totality?
Just totality.
Okay.
You see, Mr. And if the member from North Side is finished, provisions in the law to remove Part 8, which represents the petitions. No, we're still on the
On 8, legal challenge.
legal challenge. Yeah.
I'm just getting to the question.
It says that a petition may only be presented to the Grand Court by a person who voted in the referendum. That's what 8 says. 3.
How is that a difficulty?
Well, the supervisor now has the added responsibility or work to ensure these are the times when that number, which is unique to the voter, which those observers have been saying that we should get rid of, the supervisor now has to identify that person having been at the poll. And the supervisor cannot rely wholly and solely on that person having been marked off. They need to get the counterfoil plus the ballot, which is now mixed up amongst, how many electors we have? 20,000. But if we knew, like in general elections, that that person who objected was on the East End voters list, then it would only be the East End ones you had to go through. Are you following me?
Mm-hmm. But before we change to single member constituencies, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, sir, Georgetown, last time I ran for the overall district of Georgetown, there were more than 10,000 registered voters.
But you got around 1,000 now.
Right, so I'm saying
It's all relative, you're saying?
yeah, exactly.
But we have never done that before. Mixed all them together.
Yeah.
No, we haven't.
If you know,
Why are we doing it now then?
because it's a national referendum, it is a national result. It is not a constituency by constituency result.
2009. No, but in all of the elections, they were counted separately, you see. Kept separately. All of the referendums. Every one. Well, both, let me put it that way, both. They were kept separately. Huh? But why are we doing it differently, is the question. But 2009 was a national count too, and we had them done separately.
Making it more difficult.
I'm talking about legal challenge. The challenge, and the premier is saying that it's all relative, when it was just Georgetown with 10,000 and stuff. So, but in 2009 it was reported. It was counted by constituency. East End, well, we only had 6. It was counted by constituency and reported from a national perspective.
Mr. Chairman, if it will ease the members' mind, we have had extensive consultation with the supervisor of elections about this entire bill, and he is more than satisfied that they are quite capable of managing this process. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put it in the bill.
Yeah, but Mr. Chairman, I'm sure the supervisor will be able to confirm that there has been no instance where there was one counting by mixing up all the votes throughout the whole country, because if that's the case, then the elections office has been breaking the election law since 2009, in that the supervisor must report the outcome of any vote in this country, be it general election or referendum. And the one in 2009 has been used as an official report ever since 2009, the Constitution one, and it has been on the website, and it remains there as broken down by electoral districts. This one not different? How is it different? How so is it different?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know how many times I can repeat this. The government has taken the position after consultation with the supervisor of elections that this is to be treated as it ought to be treated. It is a national referendum on a matter of national importance, and the count will be done and the report will be given on a national basis. The opposition is quite entitled to its view that they want it to be treated differently so that they're able to determine how their constituents voted, and they can decide whether they're going to pick up the shovel and go down along the bay. But the government has taken a policy decision about this, and that is reflected in the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a reasonable
Member
person.
from Newlands.
I'm a reasonable person, Mr. Chairman, so I would be willing to be persuaded. If the government could tell me why it is choosing to pursue a course of action that is more difficult. The question is, why are you choosing the more difficult option? It would be easier in terms of logistics,
No, we're
counting,
not going through this again.
security of the ballots,
I'll stop at this point.
dealing with challenges if it was done on a constituency basis. So why are you taking the more difficult option?
Members,
of a
I think I
national
heard you with that
ballot?
same question in debate.
But this is, Mr. Chairman, with all due
No,
respect,
this is not a debate.
This is committee.
This is not a debate, and you've gone long past what I thought we would have been finished by now, because members are choosing to go through all those things all over, and I'm not going to allow that, no matter how reasonable I want to be this afternoon, because I told you some reasons why.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
And you have asked questions that have been answered in the debate and being answered here again. And it's really getting to the point that it's gotten back into the debate. That's not what we're here for.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking a question though, and I've asked the question, and if we got an answer, now let's move on.
Mr. Chairman, can I refer the member to my previous answer to his leader?
That's your answer.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I want to leave too. I got Miss Stella in East End, who's 104 today, and I really need to go visit her and the legs. But certainly we have a responsibility as the lawmakers of this country to ensure that we are satisfied that the laws are done in
Yes,
a way that
yes, leader of the opposition, you have every right to be satisfied, to try to ensure, but that's what you were doing in your debate, and you have come and asked questions. You have come and asked questions, and nobody's curtailing you all on this. You have asked questions. You have debated for 2 hours, and you yourself 2 hours and 10 minutes.
No, you stand. Come on now.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you.
Please, honorable members, let's be reasonable. This is not, and I'm not going to allow this debate and debate and debate. Georgetown, member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Premier just said that he was advised
Sorry?
I'm just trying to get clarification as to the Premier's previous answer before the last one. that he was advised by the elections office to treat this as a national vote as opposed to a district vote? Can he clarify that, or is this, because he's saying it's a policy decision and he's saying the elections office?
No, Mr. Chairman, I never said anything about being advised. I said the government has consulted with the supervisor of elections, and he has confirmed that his office is quite capable of executing this count as a national one. And as a matter of policy, the government believes that this is a national referendum on a matter of national importance, and the count and the report of the outcome of the referendum should be on a national basis.
Well,
Member for Georgetown Central.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I would suggest that maybe the Premier double check the Hansards, because he said that he was advised to treat it appropriately like a national debate. That's what I heard. Now, I'm happy that he's clarified that's not what the elections office has said, and that this, in fact, decision not to have it breaking down is one of a policy of the government. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you allow me, now that that's clear, allow me my last question, Mr. Chair. In respect to previously...
Mr. Chairman, I need to clarify that, because
Premier.
the office of the supervisor of elections is an office that functions under the authority of the governor. If the elections office says to us, to government, or to this parliament, this cannot work, this is the way, this is somehow going to undermine the integrity of the system, there is no way that the governor is going to sign off on any such legislation. So the practice, long before I came into this, is to have these things done in consultation with the office to ensure that the process and the integrity of the process is preserved.
Mr. Chair, can the Premier...
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the Premier say that the elections office has allowed them more than one option in respect to the results of this? One being national and one being electoral district.
Mr. Chairman, that option is there, clearly. But I'm not going to go into an in-depth analysis of the discussions that we had with the supervisor of elections. The outcome of those discussions are the bill before the bill before the House. If the opposition doesn't agree with it, they can do what they've been doing for the best part of a year, complain about it.
Mr. Chair, my last follow-up question, and this is in relation to a previous question where he delayed until he got to this point, and I'm not trying to belittle it, but he did say that he would address the concern that if the threshold was not met for or against 50% plus one, that their government would have to consider what to do. I asked the Premier, doesn't he think the breakdown in the electoral district would help his administration to do so? And if not, how will they make that decision? Any guidelines in respect to that?
Mr. Speaker, I listened to the members' debate, and he believes, I meant on the second reading, he believes that what his constituency decides is what ought to govern his actions. He will, if he survives long enough in this place to get on this side, he will come to understand that what your constituency wants when you are part of a government does not necessarily determine what government policy is. So what a constituency thinks individually has little bearing on what the government will do. What will guide what the government does is what the national vote says.
Move on. 10. Okay. Question is that clauses 7, 8, and 9 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Clauses 7, 8, and 9 do stand part of the bill.
Clause 10, trial of petition under Section 8. Yeah.
Okay. Question is that clause 10 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye. Those against? Clause 10 stands part of the bill.
Clause 11, power of the judge.
Question is that clause 11 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clause 11 do stand part of the bill.
Clause 12, application of elections law 2017 revision.
Question is that clause 12
Mr. Chairman,
do stand part of the bill.
Mr. Chairman, clause 12.4. Another issue that I'd raised in my debate. This clause allows Cabinet, by order, to amend Schedule 2. Schedule 2 contains references to the elections law and what I consider primary legislation. Why is it that we're allowing Cabinet, by order, to amend legislation?
Mr. Chairman, that is not at all uncommon, but I'll ask the Honorable Attorney General to address the point in more detail.
The Honorable AG had to step out a minute.
Yes. And Mr. Speaker, we are simply rehearsing what was dealt with in the debate. The Honorable Attorney General spent the best part of an hour yesterday going through all of this. Indeed, to the point, Mr. Speaker,
I got a point to make.
that you sought to intervene about the granular nature of the questions that were being asked. So I don't know what more we're going to be able to say that will satisfy the member, but with your permission, I'll invite the Honorable Attorney General to attempt to do so.
The Honorable AG was out of the room. Could you ask the question again, please? Repeat.
Yeah, why is there a need for 12.4, clause 12.4, the Cabinet may by order amend Schedule 2, and Schedule 2 contains primary legislation.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, sorry, at the risk of repeating what I said yesterday, the act or the practice, if I may put it that way, of having in primary legislation a provision which allows for Cabinet to amend that legislation by way of an order or by way of regulations is a very common practice employed by most common law countries that I am aware of. And it is done for any number of reasons, including for convenience or to address instances of emergency, Mr. Speaker. In a number of instances, what happens is that there are events which might require amendment to the law. They are usually sometimes not very significant amendments, and rather than having to reconvene Parliament each time, because for whatever reason they might not be sitting, the legislature or the Parliament usually delegate those functions to other functionaries, ministers, cabinet, or other public officers, to allow them to deal with those minor amendments rather than having to come back to Parliament. Mr. Speaker, these are usually instruments that have the force of law and is usually prescribed by some superior competent authority, in this case, the Parliament. But other than to reiterate that it is a very common practice, and there are number of our pieces of legislation on the books that have those provisions, there isn't really much more I can say by way of amplification to that question.
Mr. Chairman,
The member for Newlands.
I hear the Honorable Attorney General, but I'm still very concerned because if you look at the bill, there are 6 pages in the main section of the bill that I consider primary legislation. Schedule 2 is about 14 pages. So the significant body of this bill is contained in Schedule 2. And what this bill is asking us to do as legislators, the Parliament, is to delegate our lawmaking authority and ability to the Cabinet. With no checks and balance, with no debate, with no consultation, Cabinet can at will, by order, change legislation. I don't even know if those changes would require the governor to assent to them. So we're completely bypassing the law, the entire lawmaking procedural process, the entire parliamentary process, the consultation process. We are giving Cabinet sole authority to change this bill, change this law at will. And what is contained in this law, plus the election law, the references to the election law. What we're doing then is giving them complete authority with no check and balance, and they could completely change, not saying that they will, but they could completely change the nature of this law overnight, and we wouldn't know unless we check the Gazette. That does not trouble anyone?
Honorable AG.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and thanks to the honorable member. Mr. Chair, I understand the honorable member's consternation, but it is a matter of government policy, not just this government, but successive governments over the years, that this is a convenient way to legislate. And so usually, as he says, the orders are gazetted, so it is the country is on notice as to what has transpired, and if there's something untoward about it, I'm sure there's some other recourse that can be employed. But Mr. Chair, it is a very common practice, not unique to this piece of legislation, and I'm sure we will see that happening going forward. It is really a matter for government how they would want to address the honourable member's concern about the ability of Cabinet to make these secondary legislation, but it is part of our parliamentary construct.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just add to that, is that because this particular bill is obviously of great interest nationally, and there is greater attention to what we're doing here today, I'm sure, than is generally the case. I think it's important to point out that there is nothing unusual with this, with what is being done here or being proposed by this legislation. Countless pieces of legislation have schedules to them which are susceptible or amenable to change by Cabinet. Not just this referendum bill. As the learned Attorney General has pointed out, this is the way our system has worked and still works for decades.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I know
Mr. Chair, if I might say one thing, if the Leader of the Opposition would be so kind. The risk of putting this in the body of the legislation so that the only way it can possibly be changed is to convene another meeting of the Legislative Assembly is that most of these things in here relate to operational exercises. The ballot paper is in Schedule 1. There are things about the persons who are able to remain in the polling station, the presiding officer, stuff relating to observers, that sort of thing. If it is determined that there is some omission or some error, and we can't fix these particular problems without calling a meeting of the Legislative Assembly, it could, in an extreme case, completely derail the holding of the referendum while you wait to convene a meeting of the Legislative Assembly to fix it. That's why these operational matters are placed in the schedule so that they can be quickly adjusted if the need should be identified.
Mr. Chairman, I hear the Premier, I hear the Honorable Attorney General. And I've been here long enough to see schedules Cabinet being given the authority to change schedules, and Cabinet haven't been given the authority to make regulations. I agree with the Honorable Premier. These are operational matters when this is extended thereto from this Parliament, because you're not going to make me aggregate my responsibility as a representative of the people and a member of this Parliament. Because my job is to make law. It's not Cabinet's job. That's number one. Now, in those cases that we have particularly, and Parliament has enabled Cabinet to do those things, it has always been specific to that law. To that law. Nothing else. To that schedule in that law. To that law to make operational regulations. This case, we are talking about a separate law that has already been enacted, We have a modification schedule which Cabinet can change to change the law that we have already put in place, which is taking the responsibility away from this Parliament and giving it to Cabinet to make law. Make regulations, secondary legislation, fine. I'm okay with that through the process of regulation. But the election law can be amended on the whim and fancy, on the drop of a hat, by Cabinet. No.
Mr. Chair, I think I understand the confusion. The amendment, the schedule, I hope I can explain it to you in a way you can follow. What we are doing is importing some of the provisions from the elections law into this law for the purpose of the conduct of the referendum. Having put those provisions in this law, if for whatever reason it doesn't work, there needs to be change. You can change the schedule in this law by an order, but you're not changing the elections law. The elections law remain the same. It won't be amended.
But the
existing elections law remain the same for all intent and purpose. What we're changing is the provision in this piece of legislation, not the elections law. So when you take up the elections law next year and look at it, nothing changes in there. It remains the same.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that. Nothing changes there because this falls away. But I am saying this law, this bill, when turned law, will fall away. However, there are a number of areas which refers to the election law, which says that this referendum is going to be conducted under the referendum law. I'm sorry, the election law. So in essence, the schedule, if we're conducting it under the election law, the schedule will change the operation of that law and the intent of that law. Any change in the schedule for this day.
Whatever provision from the elections law you import into this law, if for whatever reason you need to change those as it relates to the conduct of this referendum, you can change the schedule in this law. But the elections law will not be touched, which is a fear of the Honorable Deputy Leader.
No, it's not our fear. It's our concern that whilst we're using the election law in tandem with this referendum law, if Cabinet can change the schedule, then in essence the operation of the election law will change accordingly to that day, to the referendum day.
But Mr. Chairman, let me give an example. The reference, we're not using the financing provisions in elections law, right? Correct? However, this clause gives you the government the ability to bring in some form of financing regulation into this bill. And by amending the schedule. Correct? So the government could then choose to introduce some sort of financing regulatory framework without coming to this parliament. And it would have, and without any discussion or public consultation whatsoever. That's serious. Another example, Mr. Chairman, the government could decide to reference another law, not the elections law, some other legislation out there for whatever reason, and again change the nature of this. Pardon? You don't know? Let me just give you an example. Well, my follow-up question, Mr. Chairman, is we seem to have been enabling the use of regulations.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, off mic, but Mr. Chairman, I understand the regulation. Cabinet has to have the ability, when the supervisor of election comes to them and said, we need to have 20 booths up there as opposed to 2, and we need to go through that road, and we need to put fence around there. Cabinet needs that flexibility and that understanding.
You can do that through regulation.
But that's through regulation, yes. I don't have a problem with that. And for the operation of that referendum on that day. But my concern, and if they can be allayed, then I am fine with that, is that when I give them the responsibility that I have as a representative here, to change other pieces of legislation. If it was just to this alone, it wouldn't be so bad. But then the problem we have is that it could be extended. And in the interest of transparency, cooperation, I believe that we need to find some other way of doing that. That's all I'm saying. I don't want to stop. I certainly don't think any member here would want to stop, to remove a provision in here which in effect affects the referendum going forward. but I don't want to give up my responsibility for making legislation, primary legislation, on behalf of the people, and give that to the cabinet.
So if we take out the word cabinet may amend the schedule by order and put cabinet may amend the schedule by regulations, that would give you more comfort? No. You just said that.
Cabinet gonna make regulation, not amend the schedule.
Mr. Chairman, just so that everybody understands the consequences of what, potential consequences of what the opposition are proposing. The Constitution, AG, what is the section is, requires that except in a matter of national emergency, any bills to be debated in this House require 21 days notice prior to the start of the meeting of the House at which it is to be debated. We have had one waiver by one governor since this Constitution came into effect. A national referendum would not be a matter of national emergency. I don't think the AG is here. The AG would advise the governor of that. So please understand that by proposing what they are proposing, and maybe that is the objective, they are seeking to defer indefinitely the holding of this referendum.
Mr. Chairman, you know this premier is becoming the most dramatic, not drama queen because it's not she, but drama he, or king, something. You know, he really taking it too far now. He wants me to, the Attorney General responsibility is to come up with ways of dealing with these things in order, he has the responsibility to advise his parliament. This parliament has the responsibility of making laws to govern the people of this country. Now he needs to come up with something to address whatever we are discussing here. That's his job. It's not mine.
Mr. Chair,
Member for Georgetown Central,
Mr. Chair,
then Mr. Eden, and then Mr. Miller.
Well, one of my concerns here is, though I see the potential fear that the Premier just highlighted about the inability to make a quick change if something goes awry. But also what we have to recognize is that if we leave the law the way it is, potential political interference can happen, and in unusual cases, I don't know if the AG can talk about this. I hear him talk about countless legislation has schedules like this in this our jurisdiction, but this is not your typical law. This is the election, a referendum law where potentially a government can make a change within quick order to make a substantial difference in the outcome. And I don't even think that this government should want to be a part of the potential of that. So just as much as the seriousness of having to call an emergency to make a change is just as serious as leaving it the way it is, because this is about democracy. Now the government has total control of the referendum process, and then can be accused in the future of potentially making changes without coming here to the full people of this country.
You all know debated that before? Sure, I heard it with that same language.
Mr. Chairman, I understand, but Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, this is one of Reagan things. Trust but verify. I can't trust any government for that matter, with the responsibility that the people of East End sent me here to with. No, it has nothing to do with the current government. It is a responsibility I have to direct cabinet. So when we do a law, we restrict them to a particular schedule. You can change these amount of days that so and so, or you can change that. All you are responsible for is to make regulation to operate this law, not to change it. That's this House job, is to do that. Ronald Reagan, trust but verify.
Mr. Eden, the member from Newlands. Sorry. Savannah.
I don't care who it is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, we're not
There.
trusting it.
They're talking.
Huh? Oh. You all want referendum? I can stay home that day.
You didn't tell me you were going to vote no. You changed your mind.
Hmm?
You didn't tell me you were going to vote no. You changed your mind.
You hear what I said? I can stay home that day.
Change your mind then.
If you all want to stab me all the time, you can do that. Doesn't look like you won't get out.
No, you want to get it right.
Get it right? Don't you?
Mr. Chair. Oh, Mr. Eden, sorry.
Eden, Mr. Eden.
Yeah, just through you to the Honorable Attorney General, the amendments that's suggested to Schedule 2, is it limited to those identified specific sections that's listed in Schedule 2, or what else it covers?
Julie, Mr. Chair, sorry, the things that are narrated in the schedule are the things that we would seek to change by an order and so. And just for completeness, I was just looking at the Referendum Law 2009, Section 9, subsection 4. The governing cabinet may by order amend Schedule 2. Mr. Speaker,
But
Mr. Chair, we've done, so far we've got to learn to trust somebody.
I think allow him to. You hadn't finished yet, Mr. Eden. You had. Have you finished answering, Mr. Eden? Mr. Eden, are you satisfied? Mr. Miller.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, to the Attorney General. Maybe some of the concerns could be alleviated if we simply removed modification from the title of under Part 1 of the schedule and just said applications and provisions of the election law. Because some people seem to believe we'll be modifying the election law. So maybe if we just took the word modification out so that the schedule would confine itself to the application of the election law. I don't know.
And Mr. Chairman, just so I understand what... Sorry, go ahead.
Because, Mr. Chairman, I think that could still allow you to define how a section is applied or not applied, and what sections of that sections and how it's applied by that kind of modification, as opposed to making people believe you're modifying the election law.
Mr.
Attorney General.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. So it would read application of provisions of the...
It would still allow you to modify that application, but it wouldn't have the risk of fear that you are modifying
the elections law. Okay. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, sorry. If that gives members comfort, I'm certainly prepared to propose that to government as a way of allaying the flares. But I really don't see government undertaking, or any government for that matter, undertaking any wide-scale amendment to any law to cause any problems and so. But I'm happy to, if honorable members of cabinet sorry, the government, honorable members are happy to go along with that, then certainly I have no difficulty with that.
Mr. Chairman, I still am concerned though, because that doesn't prevent anyone, the government, making modifications to the schedule by including all the sections or bringing in other laws or amending what is here now or making additional omissions. You know, I just don't understand. I mean, if the elections office has said that they, on the basis of this bill, they are prepared to move forward, then why do we need to have that ability to change the whole thing?
Mr. Chair, all I can say is that I am not sure what is sparking this fear on the part of the member. We did it in 2009. We had it in the 2012 single-member constituency law, Section 9, subsection 4. The governing cabinet may amend the schedule, may amend the schedule by way of an order. It is a standard provision in all of these referendum law. And so I am not so sure what the members' concern is, and so on. Sorry. I can't, the government makes a policy. And that's the government's policy that this is, we're going to follow precedent by putting this provision in the bill, in the law, if it becomes law, and so on. Hopefully there won't be any issues later on arising. I don't have any reason to think that government is about to embark on anything surreptitious or anything, Mr. Speaker. But as I said in this house before, you got to learn to trust somebody. You got to learn to trust the government.
Mr. Chairman.
And if there is something untowards that happens, then there's always recourse that people can resort to. But for my part, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, there's absolutely nothing impermissible or irregular or yet sinister about putting this provision in this bill, as was done in 2009 and was also done in 2012. It is not new, it's not something that someone came up with because this particular one has to do with referendum, because this one had to do with the port. It was done in the single-member constituency law in 2012, and it was dealt with in the other one also in 2009. It is a standard provision. And below that is also have another provision which says the governor in cabinet may make regulations. These are two standard provisions in all of these. And so,
honorable members, it seems to me that you have ventilated your concerns enough. If you were going to convince the government to do otherwise than their policy that they have put forward here, then that would have been accomplished. We are going over and over the same things. So I'm going to have to cut this part off and take the vote.
Can I just say one thing before you do?
Yes.
Because I haven't said anything yet. The thing about it is, this is the first time I'm actually saying something on mic now.
Was a different Chris I heard up there?
Yeah, first time I'm actually saying something on mic. I was saying something before off mic. I'm actually saying something on mic now. No, what I'm saying is this. Yes, I agree with the AG that we have had two bills before, but we have also got to accept that we're not bringing a bill that mirrors the other two. So since they went and they changed something, like for me, they changed the whole thing on the voting and how the voting is done, we now have to go through line by line now to say exactly what else is being changed. But I can tell you right now, I don't trust anybody. I don't trust anybody. I don't even trust myself, so I don't trust anybody.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say this if you would allow me. The Honorable Attorney General, and I say honorable, has given some assurances that he doesn't think there's anything sinister involved in this. I know he can't take responsibility for the entire cabinet, but he is a member of cabinet. So I just remind him that he's sticking his neck out very far in making those assurances, but I trust his opinion. And while we want to trust and verify, we will have the will of the government.
You've made that point over and over, and your leader has about trusting and verifying. We need to take the vote.
Well,
the question is that clause 12 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
You can sit down and make a big prospect people.
The ayes have it. Question 12 stands part of the bill.
Bring it to the attention.
Clause 13, expenses of referendum.
Bill and Mike don't work together too.
Question is that clause 13 do stand part, stand part of the bill. Question is that clause 13 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Clause 14, regulations.
Clause 13 stands part, to be clear, clause 13 stands part of the bill. 14 is regulation. Question is that clause 14.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to belittle what we went through just now, but quickly, just from the AG standpoint, just for clarity, so I can get my learning up to speed. In respect to the question that we were talking about before, and I'm not trying to go back to another point, but the AG recently said that about regulations and being able to have the ability to make regulations. Isn't this the same prospect, the same concept in this case? Of section 4, clause 4, clause 14, same concept.
Regulations,
It says, clause 14 says the cabinet may make regulations to provide for the conduct of the referendum as may appear to be necessary and expedient.
That's 14.
Yes. And to provide any other matter as may appear to be necessary or expedient for the purpose of giving effect to this law. So if we just went through that and talked about all that, well, why do we have it in another section of the law again? I don't quite understand. I mean, if the foundation of the argument was all of that before, and we have all of those concerns that we just highlighted about the potential of changing the schedules, but then you have another section of allowing you to have the regulation. So I'm just, maybe I'm mistaken of how the law structure works, and I need to understand this clearly.
Well, regulations, this is the only clause for the regulation, you know, clause 14. What are we changing this for? All those in favor? Those against?
Mr. Speaker,
Yes.
Mr. Chair, in all due respect, I did ask a question, and we just simply just put it to a vote. I mean, I know I'm a new member, but it would be right for
You're
me
not a
to
new
have...
member. You're 2 years old in this house. You're not more new member. and you know quite well what you're doing too.
No, Mr. Chair. I am simply asking a question. Is this not a matter of duplication of this law?
Well, as the chairman, I don't see that there is a duplication in this clause. I'm not going to put that question. I can't, unless somebody alerts me that otherwise that there is some duplication. As chairman, I don't see that there's a duplication here.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm taking a risk, but the vote has already been taken, but to attempt to help the member who, if he's earnest in his quest for knowledge, the schedule is a different matter than the regulations. you look through most legislation, you will see regulations which confer on cabinet the ability to make essentially rules to give effect to the law itself. The schedule usually has various things relating to how the law operates, like in this case, the presiding officer and who can be present in certain places, the form of the ballot paper, those sorts of things. So it is another form of secondary legislation. So that is the regulations are. The bill proposes to give the power to the cabinet to make amendments and adjustments to the schedule, and Clause 14 now confers on cabinet the power to make regulations to make sure that the law can have proper effect and the conduct of the referendum can be carried out effectively and efficiently. There is nothing sinister about any of this. There's nothing new in this. This is an age-old process and convention that has been hit this house long before I was here.
Question is, Clause 14 do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. Clause 14 now stands part of the bill.
Schedule 1.
Premier.
Mr. Chairman, in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 52.1 and 2, I give notice to move the following amendment to the referendum, people-initiated referendum, regarding the Port Bill 2019. Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill be amended by deleting Schedule 1.
Question is that the bill be amended by deleting Schedule 1. All in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, let me just quickly explain that. Schedule 1 is the form of ballot paper. It has on it the question that we had proposed. Because we've gone through this process, which I explained at some length, that we're passing the legislation now, and then we'll propose to settle the question. We will have to do a new ballot paper. So that will be done as part of the power to amend the schedule.
Okay.
Schedule 2.
Mr. Chairman, I move the amendment I move that the bill be amended in Part 1 of Schedule 2, in the second column, relating to Section 41, taking of poll and the ballot, by A, deleting the words Schedule 1 and substituting the words, quote, the regulations made under Section 4, subsection 4, subsection A, and B, inserting after the paragraph the following paragraph, omit subsection 3.
Thanks. No, if there are no questions, then question is that the bill at Section 41. Section 41 do stand part.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Chairman, not quite. It is that the bill be amended in Part 1 of Schedule 2,
Yeah.
in the second column. Yeah,
I will,
relating to Section
I wasn't
41.
going to take the whole thing. But
Oh, okay.
Mr. Bryan,
forgive me, Mr. Speaker, just give me 2 seconds. You can take the vote, Mr. Speaker.
Is that Section 1?
I go back to the beginning of the question. Question is that Section 41 of Part 1 of Schedule 2 be amended. All in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Section 41, Part 1 of Schedule 2 is amended.
And then section 41 of part, section 41, as amended, stand part of that, yeah.
I said that.
No.
Yeah.
Turn your mic off, I hear what.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the bill be amended in Part 1 of Schedule 2 in the second column relating to Section 57, proceedings at the close of the poll, by inserting before the first paragraph the following paragraphs. In subsection 1, subsection A, insert after the words seal the ballot boxes the words so as to prevent the introduction of additional ballot papers. Insert after subsection 1 the following subsections. 1, capital A, the presiding officer shall endorse on each sealed envelope under subsection 1 the name of the electoral district. 1, capital B, for the purposes of this law, envelope shall have the same meaning as packet.
Question is that Section 57 of Part 1 of Schedule 2 be amended. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? Honorable members, please, if you're going to need to speak, you need to catch my attention by calling my name, please.
I know that, sir, but okay.
You have a question on Section?
Yeah, but the vote has already been gone, so it don't make sense anytime.
Well, because we've been so nice, we might give you another chance.
Well, I was just concerned, sir, that
Don't regret that.
I was just concerned, sir, that 57 has
Bear in mind that the vote had gone by.
Invite men and box them around.
In this place, no good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah, especially for me. Go ahead, Mr. Speaker. I can't do anything about it now. But,
Okay, next one.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the bill be amended in Part 1 of Schedule 2 in the second column relating to Section 58, the count, as follows. Little a, by deleting subsection 1 and substituting the following. Each returning officer or deputy returning officer, as the case may be, shall, upon receipt of each of the ballot boxes, place the required seal thereon in the presence of the observers, or if no observers are present, then in the presence of 2 electors, and shall then take every precaution for its safekeeping until the count commences. Little b, in subsection 1, capital A, Roman numeral 1, by deleting the words subsection 1 and substituting the words section 57(2), and Roman numeral 2, by inserting after the words mixed together the words then separated into segments, and C, little c, in subsection 2, by inserting after the words and not before the supervisor the words or the returning officer.
Mr. Chair, just in abundance of cautions and make sure that I am clear on what exactly that meant is on a still mixing the boxes and the mixing the ballots together, that the end result will be that the votes cannot be tallied or released. The data of the findings of the vote cannot be released on a district level.
Mr. Speaker,
I just want to clarify because I'm going to vote no.
for the umpteenth time, there will be a national count and a national report of the result, not a constituency by constituency reporting of the referendum results.
Question is that section 58 in part 1 of Schedule 2 be amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against?
No. Mr.
The
Chair, can I
ayes
call
have
for a
it.
division? Can I
A
call for
division?
Yes, please.
Let's give it over.
Six, 7, 8, 9.
Honorable Alden McLaughlin.
Aye.
Honorable Moses Kirkconnell. Honorable Juliana O'Connor Connolly. Honorable Dwayne Seymour.
Aye.
Honorable Roy McTaggart. Honorable Joseph Hugh.
Aye.
Honorable Tara Rivers. Captain Eugene Ebanks.
Aye.
Ms. Barbara Conley. Mr. David White.
Aye.
Mr. Austin Harris.
Aye.
Honorable Arden McLean. Mr. Alva Saku.
Abstain.
Mr. Ken O'Brien.
Abstain.
Mr. Anthony Eden. Mr. Christopher Saunders.
No.
Mr. Barney Bush.
No.
Mr. Ezra Miller.
He said aye.
You get the full.
That's why you call it full house.
11. Results of the division: 11 ayes, 2 noes, 3 abstentions. The clause carries.
You move the other one now.
Section 61 no Premier. 7.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill be amended in Part 1 of Schedule 2 in the second column relating to Section 61 election return as follows. Insert subsection 1A, 1 capital A. The supervisor shall, for the purposes of determining the final threshold provided for in Section 70, subsection 3 of the Constitution, adjust the official list in accordance with information A, provided under Section 19, subsection 1, or B, received by the supervisor that confirms the duplication of an elector's name on the official list before making a declaration under subsection 2. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, sir, I would just explain to the committee that that provision, particularly that bit that relates to section 19.1, is put in there to ensure that before the supervisor determines the final threshold for a binding result, that the names of deceased electors, which has been provided to him pursuant to Section 19.1 of the law by the Registrar General, are deleted from the official list.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the government, and particularly that of the Attorney General, for finding the necessary clauses to address this rather peculiar matter. So we may argue and fight, but at least we found together a solution in respect to something that could be potentially seen as very unconstitutional. So just giving my thanks to the administration and to the Attorney General for assisting me with that and accepting that it's an area that needed to be addressed.
The Leader of the Opposition?
As a matter of interest, what are we going to do with births on the 19-1? Birthdays, people eligibility to be on the register, because that's part of 19-1 too, you know. Remember that? And it might not be now. I'm just inquiring. But we need to decide whether it's mandatory or. So when we
Yes.
No, Mr. Chairman, no, we really do need to look at the provisions of the election law in advance of the next elections. So
You'll come a long way. all the
I
same.
am more than amenable to doing that. I think we need a more modern piece of election machinery.
Just so that,
Please.
that members realize how far we're coming, it's a long time ago. 1972, November, general elections, I was 17. I would have been 18 in January. And couldn't vote. I did not get to vote until I was 21 then, until 1976. I was married and everything else. I know you didn't want me to vote. But just to say how far we've come, long ways. But I like just to add my voice with what the Premier said. We need to advance. We need to advance that like how we need to advance our port facilities.
Mr. Speaker, I ain't gonna engage you about port facilities this afternoon, but I agree with you. We need to have some reform done here on this election law. We need to have a commission, because as it is, the governor can't be sued in his personal capacity, and he's responsible for it and all that kind of stuff. So we need to deal with this and soon.
Mr. Chairman, I have had that discussion with the Honorable Leader of the Opposition and told him the only obstacle to getting an electoral commission is his agreement to a constitutional change, because that's what it requires.
Mr. Chair.
No, you try and barter with that. That's what you try and do.
The question is...
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brown?
I do apologize. I realize something else has come up of concern in respect to this area. Now, Mr. Chair, in respect to that authority that will be given to the supervisor, there is, obviously we know why that was done, because of persons being deceased. Doesn't look logical to be put on the list. And then it made me start to think about another section of the elections law, which is 19.2, which falls rather similar, and it talks about persons who are sentenced to 12 months or more having to be taken off the list, and they fall within that same peculiar situation of persons who have deceased, who have not been taken off the list if they have not been identified by the courts in this case. In section 19.1, it's about the register of births and deaths notifying the elections officials. I only say that because I had some preliminary discussions with some officials about prisoners who are currently serving more than 12 months under our Constitution is not technically allowed to vote. But because of the timeline problem that we were debating last night and acknowledging the issue here with the persons who have deceased, they too will be on the list. Now, based on my analysis of the law, there's nothing we can be able to do about that, because technically speaking, the circumstances with a person deceased and a person in prison is two different things. One is alive and one is dead. So they still have the right to come and vote. But I want to ask if the Premier can say, or ask if the Premier is aware of the process with the prison to make sure that those persons know that they can still vote.
When?
What is the process in this referendum?
If they're, you were asking if they can vote if they're in prison?
If they allow the supervisor to.
No, I'm just trying to hear from myself.
The question
as
is,
well.
persons who've been sentenced to more than 12 months, who has not been taken off the list, and there are some who are on the list, what is the process through the prison to let them know that they have the right to vote in this upcoming referendum?
While they're in prison?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know that there is any particular process in place, but we can, now that the issue's been flagged up, we can, make the appropriate announcements and so forth.
I hope not.
If your name, the reason why, come back to this point, the reason why we have had to make this amendment is that the official list governs who can vote. And if your name is on the list, you're entitled to vote. Dead people can't vote, although I know in some other places in the world they seem to be able to. But in Cayman, dead people can't vote. So it's not fair for their names to be counted as part of the number in terms of the threshold. It is different, though, with respect to prisoners, because if their names have not been removed from the official list, then they're entitled, they're registered electors and entitled to vote. So it's just a matter of us making sure that that communication is made. If your name is on the list regardless, you can vote.
Mr. Chair, I think the Premier has answered my concern, which is to make sure that the prison officials notify all prisoners who fall on that list that they have the right to vote, and them not believe, because they could have probably read the elections law themselves and think, oh, I've lost my right to vote, not realizing they do have a right. And those 5 can be the difference whether this port go through or not. So make sure you tell the police and the prison director, okay?
They all vote yes,
Mr. Chair, I heard your question about why I want to notify those prisoners of their right to vote, because it's our democracy, Mr. Chair, and our Constitution mandates they have that right, regardless if they've made mistakes in their lives. If they're on that list, they have a right to vote.
Question is that section 61 in part 1 of Schedule 2 be amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Next one.
I can't remember.
That's the 8.
Mr.
No, just a minute. That's fine.
We're going into part 2 now.
I see. Out of an abundance of caution, question is that part 1 of schedule, part 1 as amended stands part of the schedule 2. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Part 2 now. 8.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the bill be amended in Part 2 of Schedule 2 in the second column relating to Rule 15, delivery of postal ballot paper to post office, by deleting the word mail and substituting the word postal. You can send stuff to Korea now, though.
Question is that Rule 15 in Part 2 of Schedule 2 be amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The schedules as amended is as amended, yes. Question now is that Part 2 as amended stands part of the Schedule 2. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Schedule 2 as amended, is part of the bill. Schedule 2 as amended, is part of the bill.
That's not what I said.
No, no, it's not part of the bill.
This.
Schedule 2 as amended, it's not part of the bill.
Not this. This. Question is that Schedule 2 as amended stands part of the bill. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill for a law to provide for the holding of a people-initiated referendum on the issue of whether the islands should continue to move forward with the building of a cruise berthing and an enhanced cargo port facility for incidental and connected purposes.
Is that the title do stand part of the bill. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The title stands part of the bill. The question now is that the bill be reported to the House. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The bill will be accordingly be reported to the House.
Yes, sir.
The assembly resumes its sitting. Please be seated.
Report on bill, the referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019.
Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I am to report that a bill entitled a bill for a law to provide for the holding of a people-initiated referendum on the issue of whether the islands should continue to move forward with the building of the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port facility, and for incidental and connected purposes, was considered by a committee of the whole House. And
No, set down for third reading.
and was considered by a committee of the whole House and passed with amendments. And yeah.
He's supposed to do the report. No. Sat down for the report. So you consider it that it's reported. The bill is duly reported and sat down there. The bill has therefore been duly reported and is now set down for the third reading.
Third reading, the referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019.
Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the third reading of a bill entitled "A Bill for a Law to Provide for the Holding of a People-Initiated Referendum on the Issue of Whether the Island Should Continue to Move Forward with the Building of the Cruise Berthing and Enhanced Cargo Port Facility and for incidental and connected purposes," shortly entitled "The Referendum, People-Initiated Referendum Regarding the Port Bill 2019.
Question is that a bill shortly entitled "The Referendum, People-Initiated Referendum Regarding the Port Bill 2019" be given a third reading and passed. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. The referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019 has been read a third time and is passed. Premier? Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I move the adjournment of this honorable House until the 8th of November, the start of the budget meeting, I want to thank all members of the House for their hard work, their contributions. This is indeed a historic bill that we have passed. It is, as I said, involving a major national issue and a major government project. It is divisive and people are emotional and passionate on both sides of the issue. But nonetheless, I think we have demonstrated in this House that we have the ability collectively to do the right thing and to do, most importantly, the people's will. And so, Mr. Speaker, again, my thanks, and my thanks to those who have come and listened and watched the proceedings as well. Mr. Speaker, with that, I move the adjournment of this Honorable House until Friday, 8th of November, 2019.
Question is that this Honorable House do now adjourn until 10 a.m. on the 8th of November next. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. This Honorable Legislative Assembly do now stand adjourned until 10 a.m. Friday, November 8th. Next.